Peter Tatchell. Now, Peter has been one of the major fighters for human rights over the years. He has done some extraordinary things, suffered a little bit for it along the way, I fear, but as we were talking about with many presentations this weekend, we all feel the time has come for people to walk their talk. And sometimes it means putting your neck on the line. Well, Peter has certainly done that, not least being beaten up for trying to do a citizen's arrest on Robert Mugabe, which is more than the world leaders have really done. So this is a man, I think, that deserves our admiration. But what he's here to speak about this evening is very much to do with the restrictions on liberty that are being pushed on us at the moment, and with a special regard to the surveillance state and to ID cards. And he's going to share his thoughts tonight with us about these things. So I give you Mr. Peter Tatchell.
Thank you very much. It's a great honor to be here, and I must commend you for turning out on this beautiful day to hear me speak. Being in competition with the English summer is not a competitor that most people would relish. These summer nights and days are rare, and I'm really glad that you've all decided that to hear and talk about the issue of liberty is something that is really worth being here tonight and discussing. I suppose my starting point is that we are now witnessing probably the most sustained attack on civil liberties in Britain since the Second World War. I cannot think of another moment since 1945 when our hard-won precious liberties have been under such sustained attack. And of course, this attack is being conducted with every good intention. We are told it is necessary in order to protect our freedom that we must therefore surrender some of our freedom. Much of this attack on freedom is taking place under the guise of the war on terror. And of course, we know that terrorism is a real threat, but the way we fight it ought to be to strengthen and defend democracy and liberty, not to undermine it. Yet that, I'm sad to say, is not the view of our government. Our government seems to take the view that in order to fight terrorism, we have to surrender some of our liberties. That is the way to provide security. Well, I think we all know that throughout history, many governments have tackled freedom and tackled liberty in ways which have intended to help, intended to protect, but ultimately have undermined the freedoms of the people. And that, I think, is what we witness today. We're witnessing a slow, gradual erosion of hard-won precious liberties. And one of the great things about Britain, about England, has been its leading role over many centuries in defending and extending liberty. Liberty has been one of the great cornerstones of English progressive tradition. And there has to be, in my view, very serious, very compelling reasons why we should surrender any of those liberties. And I don't think that the current government has made the case to why those liberties should be so diminished. If we take a broader view beyond the war on terror, I think we're seeing now a strengthening of the state at the expense of the individual. We're witnessing a slow rebalancing of rights and responsibilities in favor of the state against the citizen. We're shifting from the cornerstone of citizens' rights to a new, more ambiguous, amorphous idea of citizens' responsibilities. So instead of us having rights which are inalienable, which are fundamental, which cannot be encroached by government, we are now being told by the government that we have responsibilities to the state, and that these responsibilities, in many cases, must override our rights. And this strengthening the state against the individual, I believe, has very, very dangerous long-term implications. I think we're all aware that there are now in Britain somewhere in the region of 3 million CCTV cameras, more than any other country anywhere in the world. And if you go out in a major city like London, on an average day, you'll be monitored 300 times on average by a CCTV camera, whether it be in the street or on public transport or in a shop or at a government office. Wherever we walk nowadays, almost wherever we walk nowadays, we are under surveillance. A state of surveillance that is unprecedented in any other country. Not even totalitarian regimes like Russia or China or Zimbabwe. Not even those countries have so much CCTV and monitoring of their civilian populations. And this, of course, is taking place at a time when our right to take images in public places is being encroached upon and reduced. Ken Livingstone, as Mayor of London, may have done quite a lot of progressive things, but it was under his mayorship that the right of individuals to take photographs and films in public places has been progressively restricted.
Sorry, Peter. Oh, sorry, everyone. Can I stop you for a second? I think I can solve this problem.
Okay.
I'd like to give you this. All weekend this has been working perfectly. Now, of course, we have a little problem. What if we give Peter one of the radio for a second? We'll give you one to hold. Shall I put something on the stand?
Holding might be a bit difficult. I've got juggling things around here.
Give me a couple of minutes, work on the radio. I'll put a stand here.
Okay.
You'll be able to speak straight to my mic.
Okay.
As he says, it's been working all week.
Have you got a stand? Because
If you can just take that from me, that stand will come out any second.
In the interim, I'll just carry on a little bit. I was explaining that under Ken Livingstone's mayorship in London, there's been a creeping restriction on the right of individuals, film companies and others to take images in public places. I was shocked a few years ago when I was being interviewed on the South Bank for a TV program, and along came two GLA officials who demanded to know if we had a permit to film on the South Bank. Now, this was a little tiny film crew of 2 people with 1 camera on a stand and me. We weren't causing any obstruction. The area was not busy, but we were told that we had to have a permit to film on the South Bank under the new Greater London Authority rules apparently brought in by Ken Livingstone. A few weeks later, I was in Parliament Square and I was doing a photo opportunity for the Green Party, announcing its policy of supporting same-sex civil marriage. And I was with some of the GLA members for the Green Party, and a very nice little blow-up of a big wedding cake with 2 brides on it. And we were stopped, again, by 2 GLA officials who said that we could not take still photographs, never mind film, in Parliament Square because we didn't have permission from the Greater London Authority. So this is happening. I can't ever remember it being announced. I can't remember Ken Livingstone saying, this is the new policy, you have to get permission. Somehow or other it just crept in under the radar, and myself, and I'm sure many, many others, have suddenly been presented with the fait accompli that if we want to film or take still images in public places controlled by the Greater London Authority, we have to get prior permission. This is happening at a time when the CCTV camera regime is spreading left, right, and center, no public accountability, no public control. But here, in this particular case, we find we have to get permission to take photographs of ourselves and our friends. I think if you go to any country in Europe, apart from Britain, you will see only a fraction of the cameras that we have on our streets. And of course, in many other ways, they're different as well. They don't have the creeping DNA database that we're evolving. They don't have the sweeping, comprehensive identity card scheme that is being contemplated by the government here. Now, we must ask ourselves, as a consequence, are these countries less safe? No, I don't think so. Are they more free? In many cases, yes, they are. I think we're in a situation where, in the name of security, we are surreptitiously surrendering or having removed from us liberty. What does all this say about the government? What does it say about its approach to civil and human rights? I think what it suggests is that the principle of universal human rights and civil liberties, which once was, of course, the cornerstone of Labour Party thinking, is no more. What the government is introducing by stealth is a system of selective rights, not universal rights. Okay, we'll try this one now. Technology.
It only creates more problems, doesn't it? Sure, Peter, I'll look after
it. Here we go again. Can you hear it? Okay. I have to speak really close then. The government has turned previous rights that we took for granted, having fought and won them over many generations, it's turned those previous rights into privileges which can be granted and withdrawn by the state. So that's a very different arrangement. It's a very different interpretation of the rights ethos. Increasingly, we're drifting towards a situation where rights are seen as privileges, and these rights can be diminished and removed at the behest of the state if it believes that such diminutions are necessary. I think you may recall that the former Prime Minister, Tony Blair, when he was in office, did say that, and I quote, "It was a dangerous misjudgment to say that civil liberties come first." that in the fight against terrorism, it was a dangerous misjudgment to say that civil liberties come first. And of course, we saw under his premiership the kinds of restrictions, the kinds of interpretations of rights that we have now come to see on an even greater scale. It's this attitude towards civil liberties that they can be just wished away, just flapped aside, that has allowed United States extraordinary rendition flights to use British airports, whereby bound and manacled victims of US torture programs use our airspace, our airport facilities, en route to some new torture destination. That has been authorized, that diminution of civil rights has been authorized by Tony Blair and by his successor Gordon Brown. And we've seen also their shameful silence over the abuses in Guantanamo Bay, where British residents were held for years with barely a squeak of protest from the British government, subjected to undoubtedly inhumane mistreatment and what most of us would call torture. Where was the British government's outcry? Where was our government saying that, yes, terrorism must be defeated and terrorists brought to trial, but at the same time, those people who are mere suspects, who have not been convicted of any offense, who've often been arrested in dubious circumstances, that they should have the civil rights that go with any citizen in a democratic country before they are duly convicted. We didn't hear that outcry. We didn't hear those protests. And so it's no surprise that when a government is so loose about torture, so prepared to look the other way when it comes to Guantanamo Bay and so on, it's no surprise that this government is also prepared to take a similar attitude, not the same attitude, but a similar attitude, a carelessness with liberty when it comes to its own citizens. It wants to essentially turn us into a society, a nation that is under permanent surveillance. All, of course, for the greater good of protecting us. The government's philosophy is, we need to watch you to make sure that you're safe. And that ultimately means that we are all suspects. We are all suspects in this new Labour, Brave New World. You know, we are suspects whose intentions, whose purpose, whose movements are being watched. I think there is little doubt that we are, as a nation, far less free than in 1997 when Labour came to power. And that is a pretty damning indictment, because we know that Labour once stood for liberty and human rights, that it once stood out against injustice and tyranny. Yet, in these last 11 years, slowly and gradually, it has begun to erode not only that commitment, but the actual freedoms, the laws that we have enjoyed as protection. In terms of privacy, when you look at defendants' rights in trials, the liberty to protest when and where we want, to say what we want, to move about, to communicate without being observed by the state. In all these different ways, we are less free than we were in 1997. Now, of course, we are not unfree in the sense of the Chinese people, or the people of Zimbabwe, or Iran, or the many other tyrannies that exist around the world. But all these things are relative. relative to the freedoms that our forebears won at great personal cost and sacrifice, and which we enjoyed, our freedom has been diminished in this last decade of New Labour rule. Our communications are no longer private. Under the Regulation of Investigatory Powers Act, which saw us just slip through Parliament with barely a murmur of scrutiny or protest, under that Act, already in the region of 450,000 emails and letters are intercepted in Britain every year. Close to 500,000. It's rather scary. The Times had a great expose earlier this year on February the 20th. It talked about the scale of this interception, which it reminded us was nothing like what the government promised when it brought in this legislation. It said that these powers would be used carefully, sparsely, and only with good cause. Now, I find it hard to believe that things have so radically changed in just the space of a few years that we needed to introduce this wholesale increasing use of interception of emails and letters. In some circumstances, the justification may be there, but it's hard to imagine that the justification is there to the extent that it is currently being used by the government. Your home is no longer your castle, if it ever was. A report by the Centre for Policy Studies reveals that the state and its various agencies now have a total of 266 powers to enter your home without a warrant. Now, this idea that we could be free from police intrusion without a warrant, it's just gone out the window. And again, it's all happened quietly, surreptitiously, in sub-clauses of legislation that few MPs bothered to fully examine, let alone oppose. I'd say that this Labour government has done more in the last few years than any government in the last 50 years to extend the powers of the police to encroach on our privacy. More than the last 50 years. Take another issue, the right to protest. You know, we all know that many people fought long and hard, and some died at Peterlee and elsewhere, to defend the precious right to protest, to dissent from the government, to challenge and question the state. But the right to protest, again, is being and has been diminished. And to be fair, it did not start with this Labour government. The serious encroachments began back during the Conservative rule in the 1980s under Margaret Thatcher. Now, it's true that the right to protest has not been removed. You know, we still do have a right to protest. But it's now hedged with all kinds of qualifications and restraints and limitations. It's been progressively restricted and eroded to the detriment of democracy and free speech. I think back to my youth, when I was a young man, and there were very few police legal powers to stop peaceful demonstrations. The police may have sometimes acted unwisely, illegally, even brutally, but they were not acting within the law. Now, in contrast, there are many different ways, many different police powers to restrict and undermine the right to protest, And these are enshrined in law. And that's the big difference. These restrictions are now part of the law of the land. I think we're all familiar with the fact that New Labour brought in the restrictions on the right to protest within roughly a mile of Parliament. Nowadays, you have to give the police advance notice, and you cannot hold a protest within a mile of Parliament without prior police permission. Sounds awfully like the Kremlin in the bad old days of the Brezhnev era to me. I can recall just a few months ago, I went to Horseferry Road Magistrates Court to protest against the arrest of 2 Pakistan human rights activists here in London who've been framed on false charges of terrorism. Charges of terrorism which are based on evidence supplied by President Musharraf, the dictator of Pakistan, and his intelligence agencies who are notorious for framing oppositionists. I was shocked that standing outside the court, just 6 of us, hard against the courthouse, leaving the pavement free, we were threatened with the police by arrest because this protest took place within the area of restricted protests. It was about nearly a mile from Parliament. It wasn't outside of Parliament. It was way, way down off Victoria Street. But we were told our protest was illegal. And when I asked the officer where was the boundary, he said, oh, just over the road there. So I said to him, well, you're saying that just for the sake of a few, 20 meters at the most, you're not going to allow this protest. And he said, that's right. Move now or you'll be arrested. So it just shows that although that restriction on the right to protest within a mile of Parliament is supposed to spare Parliament the din and cacophony of public protest outside, supposed to keep the streets around Parliament clear, it is actually being applied in areas well away from Parliament on issues unrelated to Parliament. Another thing we know about from the 80s is that nowadays you have to give the police advance notice of a protest march. You didn't used to have to, but in the mid-1980s, that restriction was brought in. If you haven't got prior police permission 7 days in advance, the police have the power to ban a protest. The police also have the summary power to dictate the location and duration of a demonstration and to arbitrarily limit the number of protesters. So it befalls to an officer, usually of no rank higher than an inspector, sometimes even lower, to dictate. You can only have this number of people, you can only stand in this place, you can only stay here for this length of time. Again, I have first-hand experience recently. Just a few weeks ago, when Nelson Mandela, the great hero of the anti-apartheid movement, came to London for his 90th birthday concert in Hyde Park, it was a time when much of the world was stunned and amazed that he was not speaking out against the tyranny in neighboring Zimbabwe. From a great man, we expect great leadership. And Nelson Mandela, despite all his many other great achievements, had been shamefully, and I say shamefully, silent about the murder and mayhem taking place in Zimbabwe at the hands of Robert Mugabe and his goons. So I got together with a number of Zimbabwe human rights activists and exiles, and we decided to hold a small protest of about 30 people outside the entrance of Hyde Park as Nelson Mandela arrived, to call on him to speak out against the human rights abuses in Zimbabwe, and in particular, what was then the recent rigged election. We, to our credit, liaised with the police. We told them what we were doing, and we thought we had an agreement that we would be allowed to stand near the gates of Hyde Park and display our placards as Nelson Mandela arrived. The police officer gave us his word, and we in turn gave our word that we would not do anything illegal or violent. Come the time for Nelson Mandela's arrival, the police switch the entry point into the park and then refused to allow us to move to a place where we could be seen by Nelson Mandela and indeed Gordon Brown as they arrived. And to add insult to injury, police officers then stood in front of most of us to obstruct the vision of our placards. Now, is this a free society? Is this what we expect from a democratic government and a police force in a democracy? I don't think so. The police also have the power to confiscate any placards or banners that they believe could cause, quote, alarm or distress to another person. And they can arrest any placard holder who displays such a sign. Now, this is a rather draconian power because any protest is liable to cause alarm or distress to someone, and often particularly religious folk who frequently plead distress at any ridicule or criticism of their faith. Again, I have a good example of this. Back in 1994, the Islamic fundamentalist group Hizb ut-Tahrir was holding a mass rally at Wembley Arena, where they were, among other things, advocating and endorsing and encouraging the murder of women who have sex outside of marriage and the murder of lesbian and gay people. They were demanding Sharia law that adulterous women and lesbian and gay people be put to death. They were, in effect, inciting murder. Only 6 of us dared go there to challenge 6,000 fundamentalists, to challenge what they were doing. Only 6 of us did. The police did not arrest the Islamic fundamentalists who were calling for the murder of gays and lesbians and women who have sex outside of marriage. No. This criminal offense was permitted. But when we displayed placards condemning their homophobia and misogyny and exposing the hatred and murderous incitements, we were arrested for displaying placards likely to cause alarm or distress. And we had to go to court and fight a case to secure our acquittal. That's the way things have changed so much. In addition, the police have the power to arrest a protester whose words or actions might prompt members of the public to react in ways that breach the peace. So this means that a non-violent lawful protester can now be arrested in order to prevent a potential violent, illegal reaction from others. So you can be peaceful, you can do a protest, but if you might provoke violence in others, the others won't be arrested, but you will. It's turning the whole right of protest on its head. And again, I have many examples in my long years of protest where this law has been used. Back in the 1990s, I remember protesting outside the state opening of Parliament. Just a few of us, peacefully, lawfully, we were protesting against the various laws that discriminate against gay people and appealing for the government to include in the Queen's speech legislative equality. We were arrested on the grounds that our placards were inflammatory and offensive to Her Majesty the Queen and to members of the public, and that members of the public might react against us in a violent way. In the end, no charges were brought, and no prosecution pursued. But we spent several hours in a police station, in a cell, for having committed, in my view, a perfectly lawful, reasonable protest. Whether you agree with what we said or not, the point is people should have a right to express their opinion. And I say that not just for myself, but for others. I have defended religious fundamentalists who've said anti-gay and anti-woman things. I've found what they've said offensive, but I've defended their right to say it. And when the police have tried to arrest them, or indeed have arrested them, I have on a number of occasions helped negotiate their release. And that's because I believe that the right to protest and freedom of speech includes the right to say things which I may not approve of. The right to protest is nothing if it is not the right to disagree with me or others. I think we're all familiar with the recent vote to extend the period of detention without charge for terror suspects. Now 42 days. Slowly, gradually up from 7 to 14 to 28, and now 42 days. And we know that the government wanted to extend the detention period to 56 days and even to 90 days. You know, some time ago, both Tony Blair and Gordon Brown were urging 90-day detention without charge. Way, way, way in excess of the detention period of any other democratic nation. So if the United States or France or Italy or other countries don't need this lengthy period of detention without charge, why do we? Why is it necessary that we uniquely must have this exceptionally long period of detention without charge? And of course, backing that up is the system of control orders. You know, the indefinite detention in Belmarsh prison of people suspected or accused of terrorist offenses was thrown out by the courts, and quite rightly. But instead, the government is now resorting to the measure of control orders, which are essentially a form of house arrest. Indefinite, to all intents and purposes, permanent, an incredible encroachment and restriction on people's ability to move anywhere, to communicate with the outside world. Again, if there is evidence, by all means charge and prosecute these people. But if there is no evidence, how can any democratic nation justify, in the name of whatever, the war on terror or anything else, indefinitely subjecting people to these conditions? And they are extremely onerous. You have to be indoors for certain hours of the day. You have to report via telephone to a control station. If the equipment breaks down, which it sometimes does, you get a knock on the door by the police. It is not a pleasant experience. It's not as if you're just sitting at home and got relative freedom to do what you want. There are many, many other restrictions, including internet access and who can visit you and so on. It is in essence, a form of glorified house imprisonment. We know that also that the anti-terror laws have been abused. Best known example, I think, is the case of the Labour Party member Walter Wolfgang, who was arrested under the terror laws when he heckled Jack Straw at the Labour Party conference. He was detained under the Terror Act. The Terror Act. Unbelievable. Equally unbelievable was my experience. Back at the time when Prince Charles and Camilla Parker Bowles got married at Windsor, myself and a few colleagues from the lesbian and gay human rights group Outrage decided to go along to make a point. We made some placards pointing out that Charles can marry twice, but gay people can't marry once. This is in the days before civil partnerships, and of course, even today, same-sex civil marriage is banned in this country. So we went there. We weren't going to disrupt the event, just to hold up the placards and make the point, Charles can marry twice, gays can't marry once. We held up our placards. There were only 3 of us. Only 3 of us. 2 people got lost on the train or something. So there were only 3 of us. We held up our placards. Within 5 minutes, we were under arrest under the Terrorism Act. We were detained, interrogated for only about 20 minutes. I thought the whole thing was rather comical, but even so, to have one's liberty arbitrarily denied in that way under legislation which was clearly not intended for the purpose, where our actions clearly were not of a terrorist intention or capability, strike me as rather frightening. Because, as always, if it can happen to one person, it can happen to others. These slow encroachments, these slow misuses of law become the thin end of the wedge. And if the authorities can get away with abusing their powers, they will abuse them evermore. That's history. That's history. We know that when people in power are able to get away with abusing their power, they will, and they'll do so more often against more people. ID cards are another example of the war on liberty that is taking place in our country. The big issue with the ID card scheme is not the card itself. It's the National Identity Register, the database, and its use or misuse. That's the issue. The ID bill is going to set up a national identity register. It's going to record about 50 separate pieces of information. 50 separate pieces of information. And the Home Secretary will have the power to add further categories of information at his or her subsequent discretion. Now, I know from my own experience how flawed this system is likely to be, because about 3 years ago, I was issued with my new plastic E111 health insurance card for the European Union. It replaces the old E111 form. The card has only got 3 bits of information on it, and in my case, 2 of them are wrong. My name and my birth date. That shows how big computerized systems can easily fail because either glitches in the system or simple clerical errors in the inputting of information. The ramification for the ID card system is extremely severe, because in the future, you will need an ID card to get a job, to see a doctor, or to get hospital or dental treatment, to send your kids to school, to enroll at school, to take out housing, to buy property. All these things, for all these things, it will be necessary to produce your ID card. So if your ID card is flawed, if there's some information on it that's wrong, then you may well find yourself not being able to access those services. Because the really sinister thing about the ID card scheme is that it makes the state the holder of your identity. The state and that card is your identity. You have to prove that you are the person that the card relates to. If any of the information is wrong, and like, for example, the birth date, and you give the wrong birth date, you may find yourself unable to access a service, unable to in addition to the categories I mentioned, unable to get a driving license, unable to travel abroad, unable to enter some area or institution or building which is under some kind of security restriction. So we will have to prove our identity. We have to match our identity to the identity the state has on us. The state effectively will hold our identity for us. It will allow the state to monitor our life without our knowledge. Every significant transaction we do will be monitored by having to produce an ID card, the ID card being swiped or recorded in some way that will all go on the database. So every significant thing we do in our lives will be monitored and recorded. As I said, the ID card is government property, or will be government property. It won't be your property. With no reference to the courts, the Home Secretary will be able to cancel your ID card, will be able to require you to surrender the ID card, and there is no right of appeal. Built into the legislation is these powers for the Home Secretary with no right of appeal. So the victims, the people who have their ID card either not issued or withdrawn, or cancelled or required to be surrendered, these victims will become non-persons, non-citizens. Officially, you will not exist. You won't have access to many vital services. Your ability to function will effectively be no longer. That, to me, is very, very frightening. Now, of course, the government will say, we aren't going to abuse the system. We aren't going to use this as set up some kind of tyranny. This will be used in a wholly benign way to protect our citizens against terrorism, against benefit fraud, and so on, and so on, and so on. Well, once a system has been set up, once it's in place, there is nothing to stop some future less benign government from using those powers for more malevolent purposes. Once the system is there, it is there, and it is open to abuses. And of course, the ID card system is also likely to be linked to the new National Health Service database of health records. It's also likely to be linked up to the road traffic surveillance system, which involves automatic number plate recognition cameras. It could also be linked up to the Oyster card public transport system. So what we will have in years to come is a huge metadatabase, an enormously powerful, influential weapon of social and political control, which right now may not be used against us, but in the future, who can tell? Both Gordon Brown and his predecessor, Tony Blair, said that people are making too much of a fuss about ID cards. I think they're wrong. I think for those of us who cherish liberty and personal freedom, who cherish privacy, then ID cards are the cutting edge of our future. Whether we live as free citizens in a democracy or we shift to a state snooping and surveillance society. That's how important it is. And I think that many people who look closely at this legislation now realize that whatever the government says these ID cards are for, they're really being introduced not so that we can identify ourselves or so that the government can protect us, but so that the state can identify us and keep track of our movements and transactions. And just think about the cost. I know there's a big debate about the cost. The government says it's only a few billion, maybe 5 or 6 or 10 billion. But other independent experts put the cost at closer to £18 billion to set up this scheme. For £18 billion, we could employ 54,000 secondary school teachers for 10 years. We could employ 70,000 more nurses for 10 years. 22,000 hospital doctors for 10 years. Or an additional 50,000 police officers for 10 years. Is the cost really justified? I don't think so. Could it be better spent elsewhere? I believe yes. But of course, it isn't about cost. It's ultimately about liberty. Liberty, which we must only surrender when there are good, overwhelming, compelling reasons to do so. If we look at a whole range of other issues as well, we see that defendants' rights are being reduced or contemplated being reduced day by day. In ASBO cases, hearsay evidence is now admitted. How did that one slip in? Hearsay evidence is admitted in ASBO cases. Why should ASBO cases be an exception to the rule that hearsay evidence is not admissible in a court of law? We all know that the government has proposed to abolish jury trials for certain offences. And although it's given up on that plan for the moment, I'm sure it will be back in due course. We're also witnessing an increasing use of summary fines and fixed penalties. No court procedures, no evidence, no jury, just summary fines and fixed penalties. All in all, under the Labour government, we've seen the introduction of some 3,000 new criminal offences. 3,000 new criminal offences. Now, I can be absolutely convinced that some of them were necessary, that there were gaps and new issues that require addressing. But 3,000? The government has also introduced under this Serious and Organised Crime and Police Act, SOCA as it's often referred to, that if you're arrested, you are now required to be photographed and provide a DNA sample and fingerprints. And these are kept by the state regardless of whether charges are brought or not. When I first tried to arrest President Robert Mugabe of Zimbabwe in London in 1999, after my arrest, I was fingerprinted, photographed, and DNA swabbed. And although, in the end, the charges were dropped and the case was shelved, when I requested that my information, the fingerprints, DNA, and photograph be destroyed, as was my right in those days, not anymore, but as was my right in those days in 1999, I came up against the bureaucratic nightmare of, you'll have to phone so-and-so inspector. Phone so-and-so inspector, he's not here today. Put it in writing. Put it in writing. Oh, sorry, we've mislaid your letter. Could you send an email? Send an email. Oh, I'm sorry, you sent it to the wrong person. Please send it to this person. And so it went on for 3 months before I gave up. Quite clearly, the police had no intention of surrendering my fingerprints, photographs, or DNA sample. This establishment of a DNA database, again, has been somewhat surreptitious. There's been no serious major parliamentary debate about it. Yet, Britain now has the biggest DNA database of any country in the world. Right now, we have about 4.25 million database samples being held by the authorities. Over 5% of our population is already on this DNA database, including children. The DNA fingerprints of more than 100 children under 10 are on the national database, even though young people under the age of 10 are deemed to not have criminal responsibility. Extraordinary. A further 883,000 records of children aged between 10 and 17 are being held. There's even 46 records of people aged 90 or over. Yet again, we're finding that a system has been set up, the people are going on it willy-nilly, the people don't often know they're on it, because in some cases, proper authorization and permission was not granted, or the person was not fully notified. It strikes me as a very, very dangerous trend. Why is it that the government should do this without a full and proper debate in Parliament? Where are the safeguards? Where are the protections? Where are the public scrutinies that are necessary? I think that this whole pattern of government encroachment on liberty does make each and every one of us more vulnerable to abuse by the state than ever, ever, ever before. You know, we're supposed to live in a society where there is a flow of information to the public. You know, the government even passed the Freedom of Information Act. But we see increasingly our right to know is diminished or restricted. I just had a good example. I tried to find out why 2 human rights activists from Pakistan are being held on certain charges. I want to know what was the basis, what was the source of the information against them. Because after all, this will ultimately have to be revealed in a court of law. Well, I couldn't get the information. And even members of Parliament and members of the European Parliament who've tried to use the Freedom of Information Act are being denied the right to know on what information these men were arrested, what was the source of this information. We believe it came from the Pakistan intelligence agencies, which, as I mentioned earlier, are notorious for framing political opponents and oppositionists. But to try and establish that using the Freedom of Information Act is, so far, absolutely impossible. We have a secret state which protects its secrets, protects its sources when there is no national security justification for doing so. And of course, perhaps this isn't surprising because even Parliament itself is being stymied. We see that increasingly the guillotining of motions is taking place in order to get through difficult legislation. Now, the parliamentary guillotine was intended and in the past used to prevent filibustering, people trying to talk out legislation, you know, people who are trying to be deliberately destructive and obstructive. But nowadays, more and more, when Parliament debates some of these issues, we find the government is using the guillotine to curtail the debate, to keep it short, to keep it brief, to limit the scrutiny, to limit the questioning. And I think that under the Labour government, the guillotining of parliamentary debates has become increasingly routine. Not universal, but increasingly something that is resorted to without good reason or good justification. So overall, I'd say that we are drifting slowly but surely towards a society where the state has ever more power over us. That we as citizens have fewer rights and fewer freedoms than we had just a decade ago. And that ought to be a matter of concern for every one of us. Because although we ourselves may not have yet been personally affected, although we may not have come up against the emerging Big Brother surveillance state, so long as these powers remain in force, one day we might be. For the sake of every single person in this country who over the centuries has fought for habeas corpus, for the right of the police, or the right of the requirement of the police to have a warrant to undertake an arrest, to intervene in someone's private home, for the sake of everyone who fought for the right to protest, we have a duty to make our voices heard. We have a duty to stand up against a government that, in the name of doing good things, is actually doing many harmful things which undermine and diminish our liberty. Thank you.
Peter Tatchell. Okay. Now we're going to take some questions. So if anybody has a question, I can see one right at the back there. Just bear with us while the mic comes down.
Peter, it might be worth reminding the people present here today that, in fact, we're facing nothing new. 200 years ago, the British government was so terrified of the Napoleonic threat that individual liberties were hammered down hard. And you have to remember, this is before the first Reform Act of 1832. One of the principal results of that was that agitation for parliamentary reform really started to gain momentum. Now, from 1832 to 1928, 96 years for everybody over the age of 21 to obtain the franchise was a lot of hard work. And it seems now that we're actually losing that incredibly quickly. Now, just on a personal basis, we decided to throw our television out last August. We were notified we were under surveillance. This is total bollocks, excuse my French.
I think the point you raise about the struggle for a democratic parliament is an interesting one because it sort of relates to all of this. One of the great problems is that we have a parliament that is not representative of the people. Our government, wags its finger at President Mugabe in Zimbabwe and his rigged elections. And certainly, by comparison, he is far, far worse. But we have never since, certainly the Second World War, had a government that commanded the majority of votes in a general election. Every single government since 1945 in Britain has been a government with minority support. During the Thatcher years and during the Blair and Brown years, governments have ruled with somewhere between 35 to 42% of the popular vote. These are minority governments. At the last election, in 2005, it took, on average, I think about 26,000 votes to elect a Labour MP, roughly about 47,000 to elect a Conservative MP, and 96,000 to elect a Liberal Democrat MP. And for the hundreds of thousands of people who voted for the United Kingdom Independence Party and the Green Party, they got no MPs at all. Now, that is not democracy. That is not democracy. At the last election, of eligible voters, only 21% voted Labour. Of those who actually voted, just under 36% voted Labour, but Labour won 55% of the seats. More people didn't vote at the last election, 39%, than voted Labour. Now, this to me is political corruption on a monumental scale. And how dare we lecture the rest of the world about observing democracy when we don't even have a parliament that represents the people of this country?
We have a question here.
Hello, Peter. Thank you very much for what you've said. I've been campaigning as a Eurosceptic campaigner for quite a long while. I'm quizzical as to why you have mentioned these awful words, European Union, in your talk, but raising the issues of ID cards, and especially restriction of jury trial, and now, of course, we're seeing the principle of habeas corpus being directly attacked by the detention, 42-day detention. But I don't know whether you found this particular bit of research, which was down in the book called Corpus Juris, which was published well over 10 years ago and leaked out, describing the European Union's long-term intention to impose its system of Napoleonic law over the whole of the European Union. And of course, our governments worked entirely, the way you said, to try to sort of conceal its reasons for doing things. And of course, one of the things that it misses a trick is when the information gets out early, then it can't conjure up a scenario. The original evidence is there for everyone who can get hold of it to see. And in fact, the Corpus Juris book describes the abolition of jury trial. It describes the unaccountability of a Europol police force, and in particular, in the original version, describes 90-day detention without trial, and the renewal of that detention simply on the signature of a judge anywhere in Europe, and furthermore, the removal of people for investigation before they've necessarily committed any crime on suspicion of crime to anywhere in Europe for basically in what amounts to an unlimited period, and this 90-day target. And this government, I think, an awful lot of questions will be answered by a large number of people if the first assumption was made that if anything weird happens in the British law like this, some extreme and unbalanced kind of proposal comes out, you can almost bet on it. It's because some of the European Union is cooking up behind the scenes, and our government does not want to admit it. Thank you.
I think you're certainly right to raise skepticism and concern about the undemocratic and unaccountable nature of many European institutions. And my response to that is that we actually need to strengthen the power of the democratic elected European Parliament over the unelected and unaccountable European Commission. That, to me, is the way to ensure greater public input, control and accountability over European institutions. And I'd like to see a big extension of the powers of the European Parliament so that all European institutions can be put under proper scrutiny and held accountable by our elected representatives. Having said that, you're quite right that there are authoritarian tendencies. There are only tendencies so far, but there certainly are authoritarian tendencies within the European Union who are making all kinds of draconian proposals. They haven't come to fruit yet, but we should guard to make sure that they don't in the future. On another point, I would say that, in fact, the European institutions have actually turned out to be a great protector of our liberties. I'm particularly referring to the European Convention on Human Rights and the European Court of Human Rights. Many of the liberties that successive British governments have sought to deny or diminish have been defended and protected as a result of cases being brought in the European Court of Human Rights. Most notably from my own experience, the ending of two major anti-gay laws, the unequal age of consent for gay and bisexual men, and the ban on lesbian and gay personnel serving in the armed forces. Both of those were struck down by the European Court of Human Rights, not willingly and voluntarily by our government. They only reacted to those rulings under the obligation as members of the Council of Europe. So in that sense, I think Europe has actually been, on the whole, very beneficial. And of course, we now have the Human Rights Act, which incorporates the European Convention on Human Rights into British law, something we never ever had before. It's imperfect, it's flawed, it's deficient in many ways, but it has represented a major strengthening of the rights of citizens against the state. And I'm sure you're all aware of the many cases that have been brought under the Human Rights Act to stop encroachments of state power on the rights and liberties of the individual. So once again, I think that Europe has actually been of benefit on this issue to us, but of course, that is no guarantee for the future, and you're absolutely right. We must be very vigilant at attempts to use European institutions to impose unaccountable power upon us.
Okay, another question. Just gentleman there. We'll sort of swap sides, okay? So we do one this side and then we'll come back to your side.
Hello, Peter. What level of awareness do you consider among politicians of this creeping surveillance state? Are they aware that this is happening, or do they see it but see it as justified?
Well, of course, politicians are very split. You know, there are some MPs, like Norman Baker, the Liberal Democrat MP, who've been fantastic in scrutinising and challenging these encroachments. But I've got to say that he and a handful of others have been a very small minority of MPs who they're the ones who've taken the stand, but they're just a tiny fragment of Parliament. And I've got to say that most members of Parliament seem to have taken a rather lackadaisical, even indifferent view towards these encroachments. As we all know, David Davis, the former Conservative Shadow Home Secretary, stood in a by-election, which he won again, on this very issue. He is, of course, a somewhat ambiguous knight in shining armour, given his support for the death penalty and for various other legislations that have encroached upon personal liberty and freedom. But nonetheless, that stand and his victory did send a signal that voters in his constituency believe that this was an important issue, an issue which they had confidence that he was taking the right line on. And I hope it will give heart to other MPs, but I'm not sure, because I think that a lot of MPs, particularly Labour MPs, have been bought off by lots of promises and maybe sinecures in the future. We already heard that perhaps Jeff Hoon was bought off over the 42 days detention with the promise of a job in Europe. I don't know whether that's true or not, but to be frank, it would not surprise me.
Can I just add briefly at this point that Norman Baker is already booked to be one of our guests here next year for next year's symposium, so just thought I'd throw that in.
Question here.
Hello, I'm just speaking from someone who lives just outside David Davis's constituency. I live on the borderline between South Yorkshire and East Yorkshire, and I was incredibly surprised to find the things that he was saying were never ever debated publicly with anyone that was in contention with him. And I just wondered how much support you personally get from the press and how much blacklegging or black holding out and sort of putting you down that actually happens to you. Because that's what I perceived happened in the constituency next to where I lived. You don't want to say it?
I think...
Yeah, I'm saying that that David Icke stood, and I didn't even know until 2 months after. And I'm thinking, I didn't hear it. Okay.
Peter, can I just ask you if you had the opportunity to see David Icke's 3-hour presentation on the debate he would have liked to have had with David Davis?
Yeah. I didn't see it, but I have seen other debates and presentations that he's given. But I think you're absolutely right. Governments have an agenda, and sometimes the media go along with it, and sometimes the media have their own agenda. And I certainly think that in that by-election, there were a range of candidates who had valid points to make. Whether you agree with them or not, they had valid points to be made, which should have been heard, which could have been heard, but which were not heard. And that is a diminution of democracy, because an election like that, or any election, is supposed to be about an open debate among candidates, between candidates, a discussion of ideas, a discussion of alternative options, and then the voters decide. You're absolutely right, that did not happen in that by-election. And I was quite appalled. I saw the Newsnight coverage. It was the day before the by-election, and I thought Michael Crick, who I have great admiration for, I thought he treated the whole thing with a great deal of frivolity and did not give it the seriousness that it merited.
Sorry, Peter, could I just ask
see, that's the background. That's the background that people need to understand. And I would urge you to look at it, Peter, because as a man in your position, this is the sort of background information you need for this job.
Okay, I think the point's been made. Thank you. Another question from this side. Okay, lady here.
Peter, is there anything we can do now to prevent the introduction of ID cards that you've described so clearly? Is anything being done? Is there any unified sort of protest movement going on against it? What do you suggest we can do, if we can do anything to prevent this happening now?
There are a number of things you can do. First of all, join the No to ID campaign. No to ID. It's a very effective campaign, very well run. It's been instrumental in exposing many of the flaws and potential abuses of the new ID card system and register. So joining that organisation is one way you can help. You can also join their pledge to not have an ID card, that you will refuse to comply with the system. We need hundreds of thousands of people across the country to make that pledge that they will not take out an ID card, they will not comply with the system. You can also, of course, write to your local MP and urge that he or she speak out against ID cards, and obviously send them some kind of summary, perhaps from the No to ID campaign, about the disadvantages and indeed injustices that may well or likely to befall once that system is introduced. And of course, in your local community, you can just spread the word to your friends and neighbours and family, because word of mouth is often the most effective way of all to get this message out. If everybody in this hall spoke to all their friends and family and neighbours, and they spoke to all their friends and family and neighbours, we would soon have hundreds of thousands of people aware of the dangers. And if they were all writing to their MPs, all joining the No to ID campaign, and all making the pledge that they will not comply with the identity card system, then we would have a real mass movement. And we know that the British people, when they are united and determined, they can defeat the most intransigent government. We don't have to look back to the charters of the suffragettes. It all was in 1990 with Margaret Thatcher's poll tax. Her flagship policy that she said was non-negotiable, that she would never surrender, when millions of people refused to pay or delayed their payments, when hundreds of thousands of people marched on the streets, even Margaret Thatcher had to drop the poll tax. So it just shows, united we can win.
They changed it to council tax.
Well,
2 million people marched against the Gulf War. It changed nothing. If the government is determined to carry an undemocratic and corrupt vision through, it will. And it's, sorry not to have me hand up, but is it not true to say it's slightly misleading that politicians are bringing in this surveillance with good intentions to protect us, when at the highest levels of leadership they know who the terrorists are. They know the terrorists aren't the Muslims. They know the terrorists are the spooks, the intelligence agents who are behind 9/11 and 7/7. Is it not more true to say that rather than bringing this surveillance in because they're good-hearted and they want to protect us from ourselves, is it not true to say that really a driving, definitive characteristic of a psychopath is he or she must control everything, and the surveillance state will not rest until there is a camera in every front room and every bedroom of every home in Britain, and the great British public buy it to protect us against terrorism.
Okay, let's let Peter respond to that. Thank you.
On the question of the failure of the protest against the Iraq War to stop the invasion and occupation, you're absolutely right. It was a tremendous outpouring, and at the end of the day, the government ignored the people's will. But the people did have a chance to deliver their verdict in the following year or so, when the 2005 general election came about. And sadly, most people chose to vote back in that government that took us to war. So, you know, we can't simply say it's the government's fault. We also have to say we have responsibilities as well, and that we have to do something to make sure these things don't happen. I think also the big difference with the Iraq War protests is that we, as civilians, were not necessary to execute that war. We weren't servicemen and women, most of us. With the ID card, we are necessary for that system to operate. If we don't comply, if we refuse to register, the system will not work. So that gives us some quite unique and special power.
Okay, we have another question down here.
Hi, yeah, I've been quite sort of affected by your talk. It's really great, and I'm not very academic, and it's really helped me to sort of understand quite a lot of stuff. Point basically, state of consciousness of people in this country. I mean, that's the sort of thing I look at. I don't really understand politics, doesn't mean much to me, but you know, the state of consciousness. I mean, I always thought that about the Iraq War, that the people were actually all the many people who were prepared to make that happen. And I'm actually thinking your talks made me think I need to work on myself, because in part I am responsible. I mean, basically it sums up to severe unconsciousness and people being like children, not able to take responsibility, think for themselves, and just being hypnotized and wanting someone else to show them the way rather than standing up for, you know, what they believe. And I just wonder if you have any thoughts on the sort of this state of consciousness that's sort of sweeping through this country and probably the planet at the moment, that's hypnotizing people, and people are so unconscious to just, you know, be spoon-fed this stuff. And I don't know if you get the gist of what I'm saying, but that's it, basically. Yeah.
I think there are two factors at work. One is a lack of consciousness about what is happening, about the scale of the encroachment on liberty. A lot of people are just simply not aware of it. They haven't experienced it, they haven't come up against the state, so therefore it's not on their radar. They haven't read what limited debates there have been, they haven't attended meetings like this, so therefore they just don't know. That's one issue. So raising awareness is a very fundamental thing. The second issue is the sense of alienation from the political process and the sense of powerlessness that people feel to influence things. And going back to the earlier question about the Iraq War, quite clearly that war did not have popular support. The majority will was against the war, but the government went ahead anyway. And so a lot of people concluded, well, what can I do? It's hopeless, it's pointless. And I think we are living in a much depoliticized culture, say compared to the 1960s and 70s in particular, and even the 80s. We're living in a culture where people are turned off politics because of the sectarianism, the opportunism, the dishonesty, the point scoring, the personalization of issues. And that's compounded by this sense that, in any case, what can I do? How can I change things? Well, as I said earlier, you know, we can all talk to our family, friends, and neighbors. We can all share with them what we know. We can all open them to what is really happening. And through that process, we as individuals can help build a wider consciousness and understanding, which can ultimately be collectively expressed, whether through protest or through the ballot box. You know, we will have an opportunity within the next 2 years to give a verdict on this government. Already, lots of places like Henley and Crewe and Nantwich, and recently in Glasgow, the people have given their verdict, and we just need to drive that home.
Okay, we've had a chap waiting to ask a question here. Here we are.
Peter, frightening to see how far this has gone already. It's getting far too much of a coincidence to compare now to an almost 2,000-year-old prophecy which says that the old Roman Empire, plus a bit more, in other words, the EU now, will come to power with a super leader who has survived possibly a nasty accident or even an assassination attempt that would normally have killed anyone else, but he survives. And it also states that we'll be forced to carry the mark, otherwise ID, on the back of our hand or our forehead, which we can assume is a subcutaneous chip. Do you have any views on the comparison of what's happening now as to this prophecy?
I'm not a great believer in prophecy, but I certainly think that, you know, we are moving towards that kind of society, or to draw a closer to home comparison, the kind of society envisaged by, you know, George Orwell or Aldous Huxley. You know, Brave New World, Big Brother. You know, we are moving in that kind of direction. Not by any conscious decision, not by any conscious desire, but by government leaders, and often aided and abetted by big, powerful corporations who want or need to exercise control for economic reasons, political reasons, and ultimately, I do think that right now, I don't believe that our government is a deliberately, maliciously malevolent one. I don't believe they're doing this for truly evil purposes, or, you know, that they're setting out to destroy our liberties. I think they are doing it thinking they're doing the right thing. But it is a very distorted and unimaginative and indeed threatening response to some real challenges that we face. I think it'd be a big, big mistake to see people in government as part of some evil conspiracy. I don't think it is a conspiracy. I think it's just a coming together of people with a similar mindset who've decided that this particular problem or that particular problem requires this solution. They've chosen an authoritarian solution rather than a libertarian one. And I've always believed the best way to defend freedom is by strengthening it, not undermining it.
I have a question here.
Hi. Peter, do you think that if we called it the war on freedom, it would be a much better word than to say terror?
Absolutely. I think, you know, language is very important. Language symbolizes things, and I think the war on terror, that phrase, makes it easy for the government to justify a whole host of different abuses and diminutions of our liberty. You know, most of us don't want to live in a state of terror. We don't want to be threatened by terrorists. That phrase plays into people's fears and anxieties in a very deliberate way. And I think that phrase was chosen quite deliberately. First of all, to incite fear, and secondly, to give this idea that we are at war, and that in wartime, of course, you know, some things have to change. I think, you know, perhaps war on freedom or something like that might be a much, much better way of encapsulating what the government is really doing and what the consequences of actions will ultimately be.
So if we take that home this evening with us, and when we see a paper with it written in there, say, this is the war on freedom, not the war on terror.
Absolutely.
Okay, we have a question here.
Hello, Peter. I'm from Holland, and I want to give you some optimistic view on things. There's one is when people really have a chance to change something, and you remember that the Netherlands didn't take the European law as the Irish did shortly ago. When the people really have a chance and this was made possible by referendum in Holland. They voted in a majority against European law. And it gave a very big feeling of that we were not discouraged anymore. We had something to say. The government is now trying to do this in a different way, the way they want to do it, but nevertheless, that worked. A referendum in England, a mass referendum, would be a way to mobilize many more people than you think that you can ever get behind something. And the other thing I want to say is, you left one question unanswered. Why is it so heavy in England? And why is that not happening in other European countries? I would say there's only one answer to it. The government is afraid of a certain English attitude. Like in Holland, we admire the British. We think the British people is courageous and has a sort of a bluntness in doing the good. And we think that's a characteristic for the British that is correct. And if it's undermined by giving people not a chance, then maybe this typical British character will not survive. But my optimistic feeling is that it absolutely will survive, and in the longer term, we will be very much positively stimulated also by what we found out in the crop circle things. Much help is coming to us. And we just have to acknowledge that there is more help from unseen people in high places, so to call. Thank you.
It's linked to your social card. It's linked to your credit cards. It's linked to the amount of debts you got. It's already linked in the Netherlands, far way up, further up than I ever thought. I had, because I was out of a job, go to apply for a job. I came to the station to apply. They seemed to have every hour of work I've been doing in my entire life in their computer. I had to make up a new resume. So I asked, can I have a copy? No, I couldn't. And this is already 7 years ago that it happened. Then on the other hand, you said we voted against European law. It's sneaked in at the moment. It's coming through the back door. We have a minority cabinet for the first time in several years, and it just doesn't say it, but it's sneaking it in. It's topic. The government is very busy having topics like wearing sunglasses must be done in the car because we had 3 people crashing by being blinded by the sun. That's no politics.
Okay, let's let Peter respond to that. Thank you. Let's let Peter respond to that. Thank you.
Yeah, obviously we should be aware of what is happening in other European and other countries generally, and use that or see that as a warning about how the system that the government is proposing could be used and abused. Quite clearly, this interlinking that you describe between different government agencies is something that the government has on the cards in this country. I mentioned linking up with the health service records, driving licenses and the automatic number plate registration system on motorways. It's a creeping system, which sounds from what you're saying that the Netherlands already has somewhat in advance of ourselves.
Yep, there's a question here. If you could just pass the mic along, thank you.
I feel like a bit of an outsider here because I'm from Canada. I'm not from the EU or England. And this whole conversation has really surprised me in many ways because I kind of come from the same place as the woman at the front who talked about consciousness. Because a lot of what you said, Peter, I could not agree with more when you talked about protesting against people who are advocating killing gays or lesbians or women who have sex outside of marriage. That's just so obvious to me. But a lot of what's going on here, I'm having a tough time with. When we talk about big words like freedom, freedom's not a small thing. And freedom doesn't exist if fear is used to make people do things. That's what terrorism is, actually. It's inciting fear. What I'm hearing in this room tonight is the use of that tool. And I'm more for things as opposed to against things. When you talk about your electoral system, that was really informative for me. I had no idea you didn't consider that UK was a democracy. Because for us, it's a flagship. Most of our laws have come from the UK. To hear that people in the UK don't believe they're in a democracy was quite shocking for me. My answer to that would be, so what are you doing to change your electoral system? Rather than complaining about the fact it's not a democracy, what are you doing about it? So I guess what I'm putting to you is, why are you using the tools you're using to convince people?
Well, on the last point about the electoral system, of course, there is a campaign for electoral reform supported by people of all parties and none, which would establish a system of voting which would be more representative, which would be fairer, which would ensure that governments command a majority of popular support. If we look at the systems of voting that's used in the Scottish, Welsh, and London Assembly elections, there is a model in our own country of a system which, although it's not perfect, is a damn sight better than first past the post. In the London Assembly, for example, we have a two-voting system. You vote for a constituency member of Parliament, and then you vote for candidates on a party list. And the idea is that small parties that get a sizable proportion of votes but don't succeed in getting a member elected in a constituency get a top-up series of assembly members to ensure that representation is more proportional. So, for example, the Green Party, which I'm a member of and support, they didn't win in any constituencies in London. They got some quite decent votes, but in no seat were they able to win. But when it came to the list proportion of the vote, they did very well, or relatively well, and therefore were awarded 2 seats on the Assembly. So that has meant that the London Assembly, as it's now constituted, a mixture of directly elected constituency representatives and party list representatives, that assembly is now broadly representative and very, very closely parallels the votes cast for the respective parties across London. And they've got a very similar system in Scotland, which allowed for members of the Scottish Socialist Party to be elected to that body at not the recent election, but the one before. So, to me, that's a practical example of how we can change things to ensure that the electoral system is more representative. And I'm certain that if we had a more representative system, we would have more minority party representatives who would scrutinize a lot of these issues more closely in a way that the big major parties don't. You know, the big parties have their whips, they have their party lines, members are bought off with offers of, cabinet posts or shadow cabinet posts. They're bought off with, offers of lordships or diplomatic sinecures and so on. But the smaller parties tend to be more feisty, tend to be more inquiring, tend to be less bound up with the establishment. And I think having their voices in electoral forums makes for better, more open government and a way to challenge the kind of abuses we've talked about tonight.
A question from the other side of the room?
There's a gentleman here who's been asking a lot.
Yes. You've been talking a lot about government, but it's actually, as far as I can see, the state. Because the government's like the variable leading edge, but it's actually the state that then gets the power. And it's the state that has the power, and the state, the European state or the British state. So whereas the government is elected and to an extent a variable, it's the state that gets the power. And as far as I can see, the state is the only terrorist there has ever been, and the only terrorist anyone has ever had to fear.
I'm not too sure that victims of Islamist or Irish terrorism would agree with you. I think, you know, just in the last day or two, we've had these terrible terrorist outrages in India, and we don't know for certain who is behind it, but I'm fairly certain that they are not the state, that these are real terrorists who are trying to use the indiscriminate massacre of civilians to destabilize the Indian state and to turn communities against each other. I don't think we can simply say that this is some great orchestrated conspiracy by the state, because there's too much evidence which points to the fact that there are people out there who believe in using acts of random, indiscriminate violence to advance their cause, and those people, for whatever reason, have to be resisted. And they have to be resisted in a way that does not result in generalized attacks or discrimination upon the communities from which they come. You know, Islamic fundamentalist terrorism is a reality. It is no excuse, never an excuse, to mount a generalized attack on Muslim people. We must make a very, very clear distinction between terrorists and the communities from which they come.
Okay, another question from this side, John? Yeah?
Hi, Peter. Thanks for coming today, by the way. I've really enjoyed what you said. It's been very interesting. What you said before about that you didn't believe that governments, that you actually thought they were coming from what they believed was the best interests of everybody, and that the politicians as well were, again, acting from what they believed was a good place. And I'm still sort of 50-50, and I keep switching. I guess the thing that makes me think of is, with the Iraq War, was what happened with David Kelly, and how that all seemed to be very murky, the fact that he seemed to have information, and then the whole sort of 45 minutes, you know, to weapons of mass destruction and whatever, and then it all came out, and actually that wasn't the case at all. It just seemed very sort of, I don't know, yeah, very dirty to me. Just wondered what you thought about that.
Yeah, I certainly think there are many, many unanswered questions about the death of Dr. David Kelly, and Norman Baker, who you'll be hearing from, has again been a very, very fine forensic examiner of the evidence, and he concludes very clearly and unequivocally that there are questions to be answered and that the official story does not add up. What that means ultimately is uncertain. You know, was he murdered? I don't think we can say that at this stage, but certainly there are sufficient anxieties and doubts to raise that possibility. And, you know, until the matter is properly investigated, until the unanswered questions are answered, then I don't think we can rest assured that he killed himself as the official version claims. To answer the question in a different way, is the British state capable of murdering people who threaten it? Of course it is. You know, here we are, after all these years of, you know, peace in Northern Ireland, where I'll be going tomorrow, and yet the full story of what happened during the so-called Troubles has never come out. And that story includes a policy of covert assassinations of people who were either known or suspected to support the Republican cause. You know, the British Army and the British intelligence services went out and executed, in SAS style, people they regarded as IRA members or supporters or sympathizers. The full story about that has never ever been told. We know, however, that in other situations, the British state has been culpable with horrendous crimes. You know, just after the Second World War, the British state, a Labour government, was responsible for the mass slaughter of Malayan communists and communist sympathizers who had been our wartime allies against Japan. The Malayan People's Anti-Japanese Army was in alliance with the British Army to defeat Japanese fascism. You know, we armed them, trained them, supported them. We hailed them as heroes. Then as soon as the war was over, and it looked like there might be a popular uprising to secure a communist government in Malaya, we turned on our wartime allies and massacred them left, right, and center. So quite clearly, the British state is capable of murder. Whether it did in this case, we've yet to find out for sure. But that investigation must be reopened. We've got to find the truth.
Although I would point out that Norman Baker does clearly state that he believes David Kelly was murdered, so it'd be interesting to see what he's got to say. We're going to take 2 more questions. 2 more, so one from that side, and then we'll see where we go.
Hello, thank you for your speech, Peter. It's about the distance between the people and the politicians. In Europe, we've got, they tried to bring in the treaty, and Holland and France rejected it. The people rejected it. Then recently, Ireland rejected it. We asked them not to go to Iraq, but they went. They're doing what they like, and how to stop them. What's left for us to stop them? Because they just ignore us. I went to my MP, he more or less told me to don't worry about it, what I was talking to him about. So to me, I've come to think the ultimate is we are their paymasters. As taxpayers, we are their paymasters. And this is the ultimate thing we have. If I go and stop paying tax, I'll be put into prison. But it's something that I think people have got to think about before all our accounts are connected to the system. So this is what are your thoughts on this?
Well, of course, our American brothers and sisters 2 centuries ago had the idea of no taxation without representation, and it led to a revolution. I think you're right. The ultimate power we really do have is withholding our money, because governments depend on taxes to function. And that is one weapon that we do have, and which we did successfully use in overturning the poll tax. But as one of the speakers from the floor mentioned, of course, it was replaced by the council tax. And now we have some very brave, mostly senior citizens who've refused to pay the council tax because of its injustices and iniquities. And their courageous stand, in some cases going to prison, has helped put this issue on the agenda. And I think if more people refuse to pay the council tax, then we would find that it would go further and further up the agenda. We've seen the lorry drivers protest over fuel prices. It's not actually a cause I support. I'll say that. I'm honest about that. But I think they have shown that using their collective power, they do have the capacity to make governments sit up and listen, and thereby put issues on the agenda. The same with Fathers for Justice. Whatever you agree or disagree or think about the individuals involved, they certainly help put the issue of fathers' rights and responsibilities in divorce cases on the agenda. And you may disagree with them, but they're provoked to debate, and I think a very healthy debate about the rights and responsibilities of fathers, which otherwise wouldn't have happened. So there are many, many different ways we can raise these issues, and there's many different ways in which we can pressure governments. I think the big problem is if a few people refuse to pay their tax, it's easy for the government to dismiss and indeed to penalize them. If hundreds of thousands and millions of people refuse to pay their tax, then that's a very, very different ballgame, and that's what really scares the government. Ultimately, we, the people, have the power. It's up to us to decide whether we're willing to use it.
Well,
yes, for people who taxed at source, this is true.
Okay, let's have one last question. Okay, there seems to be none from this side. Somebody from that side? Sheila? Okay, the mic's just coming. There we go.
Yeah, I'm from Ireland, same as the other guy there. And we have PR, proportional representation, which meant we used to have elections every 18 months for all the years I was there. And I used to think that was a bad thing. But at least people like Trevor Sargent, who is in the Green Party there, he's on the front, you know, he's in cabinets, he's in various, on various committees and so on. And the small person does seem to get listened to. Now, whether or not that's a function of the size of the country, and Britain being so much bigger, it's harder, I don't know. But over the Lisbon Treaty, I was proud, even though I live here and didn't vote in it, I was proud that Ireland actually stood up. I don't know all the issues, I don't really care. The point of it is that if we disagree with something, it seems to me that these governments, the EEC, the whole lot, have already decided that we're going to vote for them, and they've already got legislation in place, and we're just a fly in the ointment. But, you know, it has to be that way. Politics has to be that people put a fly in the ointment. And there should be talks like this on all over the country every week. There should be. This is politics. What we see on television is orchestrated. It doesn't seem real. It's not the people speaking. And I just want to thank you for what you said, and it's been really good. Thank you.
Would you like to give some closing words, Peter?
Just in response to what you've said, maybe I could throw out a slightly left field idea off the back of your comments there. I just wonder whether the nation state as we know it has actually had its day. You know, is the United Kingdom, does it serve any real functional purpose? Scotland, a small country, seems to manage quite well, and I'm sure one day will get its independence and function like many other small countries in a broadly good and progressive way. I would quite like to see the breakup of the United Kingdom. I'd like to see power devolved. I'd like to see you know, a replication of the Scottish and Welsh parliaments in England. I'd like to see regional parliaments. I think we should abolish Westminster and establish regional parliaments closer to the people, more accountable to the people, more responsive to the people, because that's the pretty much universal experience. And we don't need the national parliament in Westminster anymore. You know, we could just have a regional... Sorry?
That's all over, I'm afraid. And you better deny it now, please. You're a Green Party member, you support membership of the European Union, everything is come out.
Okay, thank you. I get the point.
You know, I think, you know, devolving power closer to the people is broadly and generally a good thing. That, together with a change in the electoral system, to have an electoral system that's proportional and fairer like the Scottish and Welsh, I think these kinds of changes, they're not a panacea, they're not the answer, but I think they are part of the solution. And I think that, you know, the United Kingdom came into being in a period of empire, in a period of nationalism. The age of empire is over. I just want to throw out the question, do we really need the United Kingdom as it currently is? Could we just as easily function as self-governing regions within the democratized European Union? Now, I know you may not agree, but if there's nothing wrong in principle with the European Union, the way it's currently constituted is problematic. It's unaccountable, it's undemocratic. But if it was genuinely democratic, if we could pool our resources and have a common agenda for freedom and civil liberties and human rights, a common agenda for peace and disarmament, a common agenda for workers' rights, a common agenda for environmental protection, within that framework, I think we could actually have a much better, more effective, accountable, and democratic government. So that's my final thought. But of course, no system is automatically and universally and irrevocably better than another. The ultimate thing we have to always ensure is that whatever system of government we have is a system which enshrines the rights of the individual, personal freedoms, human rights, liberty. As I said at the beginning of my talk, the long English tradition of struggling against tyranny to defend the rights of the citizen against the state. If we anchor our nation or our region or our communities in those principles, then we will live not only freer lives, but happier lives as well. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, Peter Tatchell. Thank you very much indeed.
Can I just give a quick plug for my human rights?